Good morning, and welcome to our live stream power event, Accelerating the Future. I'm Grady Johnson, group publisher of SC Biz News. In Greenville, we are GSA Business Report. In Columbia, we're the Columbia Regional Business Report. And here in Charleston, we are the Charleston Regional Business Journal. And what you're about to see is a live event. It's not scripted. We're here in our studio in North Charleston with our panelists. And these events couldn't be possible without support from our partners and sponsors. And we're going to hear from a few of them this morning, and then we'll be back for our panel discussion. We'll be right back.
Like every other institution, you can earn a credential. You can get started on a career here, but we're concerned about so much more than that. We're concerned about your character. We're concerned about your calling to the things that matter and your commitment to Jesus Christ, so that when you go into this world, in every sphere of influence, you can make a difference in the world because you have been called by God to do that. That's the kind of place that you've come to.
Hi, my name is Armin Asadi. I'm a managing partner with the Verizon Business Group. I lead an organization that works with small and medium businesses across the Carolinas. Specifically, our coastal South Carolina team has been working with business clients throughout the pandemic on assisting them with collaboration tools, increasing the communication effectiveness as people work remotely, helping them with potentially contactless transactions for their employees and for their customers to make it a safer environment, all under the goal of helping to lean operational costs wherever available to ultimately help you business owners and business drivers on growing revenues. If you'd like to learn more about any of the products and services and how Verizon can partner with you, please use the chat field. We appreciate the partnership and we appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Welcome back. If you've been to any of our live events, you'll know that audience participation is an important part of it, and we're trying to recreate that as best we can here using this virtual studio. There's two ways you can participate. Just go to the YouTube chat window and ask a question, and we'll put it up on the monitor for our panelists. So we'd love to have your questions from the audience. The other thing we found is that the chat window is a great way to communicate among yourselves. So feel free to use that chat and just make comments back and forth as the discussion progresses. To start our panel discussion and kind of set the stage, we've got some data that we wanted to display. So we've created a data clip from Cradle to Career. So we're going to run that and then we'll be right back. Okay, so today we're joining the studio with Phyllis Martin, CEO of Tri-County Cradle to Career. We have Kendra Stewart, director of Joseph P. Riley Center for Livable Communities at the College of Charleston. And through the magic of the internet, from his office, we're joined by John Simpkins, president of MDC. And I'm going to just stop right there. Everyone usually in our office knows about Cradle to Career or College of Charleston, but John, tell us just quickly what MDC does.
Sure. MDC for over 50 years in 13 states across the South has been dedicated to realizing what we call the thriving South, which is a South that uses economic mobility as a tool to achieve equity across the region. So we work with states, localities, and individuals to drive progress to post-secondary attainment, make sure that people can get the training that's going to allow them to lead lives of meaning.
Great, thanks. So just jumping in with the first question, in the next few months, working people could very well be forced to make decisions that limit income or will impact the education of their children. And so, just for the panel, just start with you, Phyllis. What's at stake for that big decision?
Yeah, Grady, the reality is we are just living in, and it sounds cliche, unprecedented times. And we have new information that hits all of us on a daily basis. And so it becomes challenging to know how to make decisions. I think it's something we're all struggling with, and we're facing our own securities and anxieties about what choices are the right choices. So we know that COVID-19 and the pandemic has illuminated the interconnectedness between financial stability, choices families have to make, health, education, and I would say race as well. And we're in this pivotal moment in time. So we know some workforce data that as of June, the unemployment rate was around 9% for the metro region. And as the data clip pointed out, there are more than 163 working parents with children under the age of 17. There are 120,000 children in home with both parents in the workforce. There are 80,000 of those families have children between the ages of 6 and 17, and 40,000 have children under the age of 6. We know one of I think the greatest challenges that we have, and opportunities if we choose to look at it that way, is around reliable early childhood education and out of school time care. It will be essential for parents if they're going to fully re-engage in the workforce. And that in return is essential to the region's economy getting back on track. Here's what I can tell you just as another piece of information to be thinking about the decisions that parents are going to have to make, and also information for businesses as they're working to try to find solutions to support their employees in making these decisions. The Institute for Child Success out of Greenville, South Carolina, did a survey in early April. They're about to release, to refresh that. But what we know with the onset of COVID-19 was that South Carolina had lost roughly 50% of the child care providers. They had closed, and there are reasons we could talk about. We could do a whole hour broadcast on early childhood education and the challenges and opportunities that exist for that. That figure right now is closer to 30%. So when we look across all parents and families, having access is one question and one area that we have to be thinking about. Availability is another very real issue that we are facing as a region and a state. We also understand that for older children, out-of-school time care is absolutely critical for parents who have to go back to work, and that is whether parents are working out of the house or whether they are working in the home. And so the reality is we are learning to understand and assimilate this data into our thinking, right? It's our reality. And I think one of the things is at stake, or maybe I'll say it a different way, is what is our ability as a region, as a community, to think innovatively about solutions, whether they are temporary or for the long haul, and that are equity-based, that are based in equity to help all of us through this what is seemingly impossible time.
Kendra?
Such a great answer. Hard to add very much to it. The only, thing I would add is that, of course, education we have seen gives you greater flexibility as to how much you're able to work at home, or to actually have the option to have your children at home and schooling them during this time. If you don't have a high school diploma, what we found from national studies is about a quarter of folks without a high school diploma actually have the option to work at home, and so 75% do not. And so thinking about solutions that really consider the people who don't have any option, that they have to show up to work or they lose their job, and that those folks are much more likely, of course, to be, not having any options, because if they don't show up to work, they don't get paid. And with about a third of the people in our region being cost burdened in their housing, meaning they pay more than 30% of their income towards their housing, the implications are astounding. As if you even just have a temporary setback in work and don't show up for a few weeks and don't have that opportunity of having a job where you get paid regardless, that this could have tremendous create tremendous systemic problems regarding food and housing security, and the implications could be devastating for a lot of folks in our community.
John, what are your thoughts on that?
The good thing about going after two well-informed panelists like Phyllis and Kendra is that I don't need to add much. What I will do is add some additional context. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, observed as we were heading into the pandemic that perhaps the worst outcome here is that those people who were just pulling out of the 2008-2009 Great Recession would be plunged back into a period of insecurity as a result of the economic downturn. And I think that is one of the worst effects that we're currently realizing. When we think about school and work, there's a Harvard Business Review article from 1991 that says school is about working and working is about learning. So there is actually a connection between the two as well, that it's worth remembering that school serves a function of preparing people for the workforce, but it's more than that. Education is about developing the person, education is about developing the citizen, and education is about developing the worker. And I think thinking about all three of those things as how we want to create lifelong learners shines an even greater spotlight on the need to ensure that we have security for the educational experience. And in looking to provide that security, I would suggest there are a couple of, or maybe three missing pieces to the education business conversation. And that is thinking about technology as a tool and enabler, always with a focus on equity, as Phyllis pointed out, so that we're not leaving people behind when we move to virtual environments, and that we don't create a divide between those who have the resources to attend in-person instruction and those who are forced to rely on virtual education because of their circumstances. Government is a facilitator and a consensus builder, and during this time of CARES Act funding, it's also a source of resources, and so we have to be careful to find ways to utilize that. And then lastly, the social sector as a node of local engagement, partnership, and co-creativity. This is a way to engage with the communities who are most affected and give them an opportunity to play a role in crafting solutions to address these problems.
So Phyllis, school's about to start. Do we have adequate plans in place that open, that are workable for families, for schools, for students, for teachers, for communities? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, what I know is that our schools in the region are working diligently to try to best determine every possible scenario and ensure that they are ready and able to provide the best education they can. across a variety of vehicles, as John said, whether that is virtual, whether that is in person, whether that is hybrid, while taking into account the disparities that existed and continue to exist and are magnified and amplified by the virus. And as I have said to my team on a daily basis, the earth is changing, sometimes moment by moment, hour by hour. And if there was a, let me be the first to say, if there was a silver bullet, we would all share it and rally around it. I think what we know is that from a leadership perspective, we have to remain adaptable and flexible and innovative. We have to acknowledge and recognize that there were systems in place with regard to education and with regard to sectors that surround education that were not working for many children and families, particularly Black and brown families and children living in low-income homes. Those systems were not working prior to the pandemic. Those systems are not going to, we can't go back to those systems, and we can't depend on those systems in this moment of time. So what we see happening is in partnership with school districts, and we see, I think as John so aptly said, government, the not-for-profit sector, the reason we're here today, the business sector as well, coming together to be as proactive, adaptable, and flexible as we can to help provide and build solutions.
So for everyone, if we open schools and we have a scare, and then suddenly we have to close for some weeks or months, what could the business community do to help mitigate the impact on families? John, I'll start with you on that one. What can we do to help in that instance?
Do what businesses do very well. One of those things is to plan, come up with best, likely, and worst case scenarios and communicate those. Communicate those to the people in your organization, and communicate them to your peers and colleagues as to what's the game plan if we experience a period of reduced transmission and infection rates and people can go back to school in person. That's great. If we have to close again, then how do we adjust? Where we find ourselves now is at least at a point where we know a little how to react to this now. And unfortunately, we've learned a lot in the last few months. And as Phyllis mentioned, we've become adaptable and flexible and innovative. What we also have to do, and what businesses do well, especially entrepreneurial enterprises, is to be comfortable with ambiguity and imperfection. That we're not going to get this perfect every time. We're not going to land on the right answer every time, but we're going to iterate. We're going to keep moving through until we get solutions that work for everyone. And as we specifically think about those who are most vulnerable, the people who have to go to work, if they're likely to experience some kind of infection event, are going to be also the people who are least likely to be able to respond to that because of the resources that they lack. So there's a measure of grace that's required, flexibility and creativity, which is a hallmark of any good entrepreneurial enterprise, but also grace, the ability to understand that people are in unprecedented times.
Kendra, what are your thoughts if we have a bad bounce?
Well, I think the challenge of being cognizant is, John mentioned having a plan and being cognizant of where folks are is really, really going to be important. Mayor Riley said after Hurricane Hugo that a crisis catches you where you are. And that's definitely something we have seen in this region regarding COVID. And the challenges that already existed have just been exacerbated and grown exponentially. And so And at the same time, this creates real opportunity for us, as Phyllis mentioned earlier, to rethink the way we've been able to do things and the way we've done things in the past and the opportunities that exist. And just being willing, as John said, to be creative and to be supportive of trying new things is going to be so significant and so important as we figure out and try to understand what it is that's needed by the folks in our region.
Phyllis, to your knowledge, has anyone been organizing around this thought of sort of strategic planning, the what next if we take a bad bounce? I mean, is the business community doing anything to your knowledge?
Such a nice
sort of as a
segue
group?
to what I was hoping you would ask.
Okay.
What I was hoping,
it wasn't a setup.
Or what I was hoping I would be able to jump in and say. So I know we've got, I'm assuming we have viewers who are watching now who are part of the business community, and I know there's a way to interactively chat. And so if you're out there and watching, we would love to hear your best practices or what's working or what you're doing in support of your employees during this time. The other thing I would like to add is Cradle to Career itself is in the process of putting together a business, I'll call it advisory council for lack of a better say it. We would love the opportunity to bring business minds together to be part of building a roadmap that allows our children to get on and stay on the path to economic mobility that benefits children and families and our community. It's tied directly to Cradle to Career's model, which is all sectors have a role in education, maybe now more than ever. And so we would love to bring some of the business community together to help build that roadmap and allow all of us to use the capital that we all have, our social capital, moral and reputational capital, to help create this new pathway.
So, just sort of take a deeper dive into that sort of concept. What specifically comes to mind that businesses could do for families, especially those with small children? That's a pretty big impact on that worker. Yep. Speaking as a father, so what specifically what could we do, and that would be for the whole panel too. So John and Kendra kind of be thinking about that answer. And Kendra, you want to take that first?
I was going to let.
You're going to let. We just all follow.
I'll jump in to get us started.
Okay.
We are really proud to partner when we can with the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network, and they have a partnership with the National Employment Law Project. And I think we can get this information up on the screen, and if not, Cradle to Career will certainly make it available on its website. But there is an employer best practices manual that has been put out, and some very specific things. This is certainly not a comprehensive list, but employers can make available emergency paid sick time, provide emergency benefits to workers, things we're doing at Cradle to Career, which is increasing schedule flexibility, looking at different ways for our team to get the job done, make reasonable accommodations for high risk workers. So the document that I mentioned also mentions what would seem obvious, but creating safe workspaces, maintaining benefits for furloughed employees, looking at shared schedules. There are some really tactical things that businesses can do if we're looking for kind of those on-the-ground first step things that we can make sure are in place to support our teams.
Kendra?
So as Phyllis mentioned earlier, about 163,000 workers we know have children at home. And we also know that in this region, about 40,000 children don't have access to broadband at home. So thinking about perhaps ways that businesses could support their employees who have children who are in school, particularly if there's a time again when they have to be sent home from school. Because the thing we know nationally is that low-income children, as well as Black and Hispanic children, are a lot less likely to get good online instruction at home. And in fact, one national study found that about 38% of white children were getting good instruction at home, where that was only about 14% of Black children. And more alarming, about 40% of African American children were getting no instruction while they've been home since March. So thinking about ways that perhaps if this happens again in the fall, businesses could support working parents with children who are now needing to be educated at home, whether that's through technology, time off, or other things, could be really critical to the future workforce in this area.
Yeah, there could be some technology aspects that we could leverage from the business community for sure. John, any further thoughts on that? What
yeah, just
businesses can
to
do?
follow up on the technology point and thinking about building capacity and infrastructure, we're at a point right now where the USDA and the FCC have hundreds of millions of dollars in CARES Act funding to build out our broadband infrastructure to respond to the effects of COVID-19. And we also have the great fortune of having someone who's overseeing that funding, Congressman Clyburn, from South Carolina. And I think one thing that businesses can do is to engage with the congressional delegation and ensure that some of that funding, to the extent that we can, comes into places in South Carolina where if they're forced to go virtually, students actually do have a chance to engage with their instructors. There's one school district along the I-95 corridor where 30% of the students during the time when they shifted to virtual in the spring just disappeared. And that's not actual instruction, but businesses through their engagement with our local elected officials and our federal elected officials can ensure that we actually get the funding that we need to build out that capacity.
So we're going to take a break right here, go to a message from another one of our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
Good morning. My name is Betsy Fanning. I'm the head of school at Trident Academy, located in Mount Pleasant. We're a school for children with language-based learning disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia. We are so proud to be a sponsor of the Cradle to Career virtual breakfast this year. We use the data that they provide to help inform our outreach programs. We have one right now with Meeting Street Schools, and we're really excited about what's happening there. We are also using it this year to inform how we do our primary grades, our kindergarten through second grade. We decided that due to the fact that third grade is that big hump where we are trying to get all the kids over, we're lowering our tuition in K through 2 this year to help families better afford to get the help that their children need for early intervention. And with that, I think it's time to head on to breakfast. So grab your coffee and your toast and let's eat and hear the latest from Cradle to Career. Thank you.
Welcome back. So we were chatting during the commercial break. The Cradle to Career does have a broadband playbook. So do tell.
So when COVID hit, Cradle to Career pivoted its focus to be thinking about not so much immediate response, but how could we be of benefit and relevance to the region when it came to recovery. And we have a very diverse, amazing 26-member steering committee that has been looking and analyzing data. I think I mentioned that the Institute for Child Success is our data and evaluation partner. One of the first pieces of work that came out was acknowledging just what John and Kendra both have said, that we have opportunity to ensure that all children have access to broadband and focus particularly in those areas of the region where they don't. So we have developed what we're calling a broadband playbook. It is will be in partnership with all of the other work that's going on throughout the community, and we're happy to share more about that. Simply reach out to us at Cradle to Career, and that will become more public as we get further into the work.
Good to know.
Yeah.
So I'm going to flip the last question and look back a different direction at it, from through the lens of an employer, and because I am one. So, many of us are struggling through this pandemic with reduced revenues, reduced workforce sizes. Some of our businesses here are down 50% or more in revenues. which is putting an incredible amount of strain on management, both financial and mental management of these businesses. So, and John, I'll start with you. Just kind of flip it the other way. What can employees do? How can businesses help employees help the employer? What should employees do to make this sort of a two-way street?
One of the things employees can do is to make those concerns known. In some organizations, I've seen employees suffer in silence, and maybe they don't even feel empowered to say anything about some of the struggles that they're facing. And if they're having a difficult time balancing that work-life, those work-life commitments, to really bring those to the attention of the people in their workplace and then come up with some solutions that will work, understanding that we're in a time when there are sometimes no really good answers, and all of those answers will require some measure of sacrifice. So I think this notion of shared sacrifice in the service of a greater goal, which is preserving the business, which is going to preserve the job, which is going to allow you to maintain that standard of living, it may mean taking a step back. But I think if that's a shared decision and a shared activity between employer and employee, it's a lot easier to take than feeling like it's a one-way discussion.
Kendra, how about thoughts?
I think just being aware of the situation and making wise decisions regarding staying healthy and safe. And, I think we've made a lot of progress in ways to try to reopen our economy and reopen our schools. And so, I think we all have a part to play in seeing this recovery move forward, and particularly as Phyllis mentioned earlier, with the reopening of the schools and trying to get those back on progress to allow again our employees to get back to work and be fully capable and able to be there.
Phyllis, anything to add to that employees could do?
I like to think about that, Grady, as a partnership between employers and employees. And what I have found throughout my time doing this work in this community and other communities is that sometimes the answers are just sitting in a conversation, and employees think they have an answer, and employers, of course, are trying to make the best decisions they can and have answers. And much like doing the work in a not-for-profit organization, somehow it is the union or the coming together in a conversation that, if provided the space and the safety, but a truly authentic conversation, I can promise you some really innovative and cool answers and are going to emerge. And there might be answers for the moment or things to try, and some may or may not work. As I've been sitting here just thinking about this, it goes way back. I think I started in this work during the total quality management days, which was
I remember that.
A long time ago, right? But the premise behind that was those closest to the work, right, could be responsible for building solutions, right? And that's how that's what comes to mind when I think about this. That those who are closest to the pain, right, could be part of the solution if given the opportunity. And I am not minimizing that speaking truth to power can be a really scary thing. So it's incumbent upon all of us to be able to create that space and that openness.
So we're at a time, just switching gears a little bit, we're at a time when conversations around race have reached a tipping point. And, as you said in the beginning, we're at this intersection of race and poverty, education, let's talk a little bit about how all of those intersect and what, the point in time in which we sit. And John, I'll kick that off with you. Just some thoughts on sort of this point in time and this intersection of all of these things.
Sure, and I'll start with a story that illustrates that this isn't new. I grew up in to in an established African American neighborhood. That neighborhood existed because Julius Rosenwald, who was an executive with Sears, Roebuck and Company, decided to fund the construction of schools for blacks across the South. I grew up across the street from what is called a Rosenwald School. My neighborhood exists because that school was built in the early 1900s. People who wanted their kids to go to school and get an education moved closer into that area around the school. They put up half of the money for the school and created this community hub. And that continues to be an enduring physical symbol of the relationship between race, poverty, and education. That school became an engine for economic mobility. And we still see examples of it in the now elderly graduates who are still living lives of dignity because they understand that there's dignity in the work that they were trained to do, whether they're trained to be teachers or electricians or homemakers who would either make their homes and make the homes of others. All of that is for me a very clear example of how race, poverty, and education come together. Education is an engine for economic mobility. It is an engine out of poverty. And to the extent that it becomes racialized or the quality of it is affected by a racial lens, we all suffer. It's like having a great quarterback and keeping him on the bench because you've decided to make other choices, but you're not really looking at and leveraging all the talent you have around you.
Kendra, how about you?
You know, really, when you look at the data here, it tells a very significant story about that intersection. So in our region, if you're African American, you're twice as likely to not have a high school diploma than if you're white. And if you're Hispanic, you're 3 times as likely. And as John mentioned, education is so connected with income and poverty. So about a quarter to a third of the people in our region who don't have a high school degree live below the poverty line, where only 3 to 4% of people who are college educated live below the poverty line. The median income for folks who don't have a high school diploma is in the low 20s in our region, whereas if you have a high school degree, it's in the 50s, and a higher level degree in the 60s. So huge income gaps related to education. And then the education attainment, because of the legacy of our history and systemic challenges based on the color of your skin, definitely disproportionately impacts people of color, brown people, black people, and the levels and the access they have to education, and then as well as jobs. And then regarding unemployment, just since COVID, we've seen, nationally, about a quarter of African Americans losing jobs after COVID, whereas only around 10 to 11% of whites. So that impact, the level of education provides a lot more job security as well, and we've seen that in our region as well in terms of unemployment claims.
Phyllis?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything I say might just be saying what John and Kendra have said differently. I might only add, and I'm sure you've heard this before, that public health professor at Harvard, David Williams, said that one zip code is a better predictor of health outcomes than a person's genetic code, which, if you sit in that for a minute, says a lot. I think the same also applies, as Kendra said, as we're thinking about education, wealth, food, the criminal justice system. We look across the South, we know that mobility rates, economic mobility rates in the South are low, particularly low for Black and brown children or children from low-income families. And so, Cradle to Careers put out 5 years of reports. I think your audience knows that, pointing out the impact of systemic racism on educational outcomes. And we know emphatically now that there's a direct impact on an individual's ability to build wealth, home ownership, and all of the things that we've mentioned. So I would say this is not new. Maybe it's coming to the surface more now, and maybe my hope is that we're all hearing the information through a different lens and taking more time to think about what that really means for us as individuals, as a county, as a region and a state.
So I always take things back to that to that business angle. So Kendra, I'll start with you with this. What can businesses do? Business owners, business managers, people in business who tend to have, some, I'll call it power. What can businesses do to move this needle?
Well, and I think part of this goes back to what both Phyllis and John said earlier about having a conversation with maybe people who work for them or with them that they maybe often don't listen to as unintentionally, rather than assuming we know things or policies that could be implemented within the workforce that would be helpful. Engaging folks in a conversation regarding what it is that is needed or what type of supports could be put into place that could make things better or provide better opportunities. Being cognizant of the role education plays and providing opportunities for employees to further their education or continue their education or support for their children so the next generation has those opportunities. And, I think that just the whole mind shift we're seeing now where people are becoming more cognizant and aware that these systemic challenges exist and reflecting and asking ourselves, what role do we play in that? There's been a fair amount written regarding policies that exist that unintentionally harm people, women and people of color in the workforce, because so many practices and policies we have are written at a different time and are seen as being neutral, color neutral and gender neutral, when really they have disproportionate impacts on people in the workforce based on the place where they are or their sex or the color of their skin.
Mm-hmm. John, what advice do you have from business to the business community on moving this needle on all of these disparities?
I would focus on two things, talent and liberty, because a lot of my business friends are libertarians, or at least they have a libertarian strain, and I'll come to that in a moment. But most immediately, just thinking about it in practical terms, if there is talent that you can unlock in your community, then you're doing yourself a disservice not to attempt to leverage that talent. And we have more talent in our communities than we've taken advantage of, that we've leveraged. And taking advantage of that talent also means giving those individuals opportunity to move up the economic ladder, to provide some measure of financial security for themselves and for their family. I've been very fortunate, but I've also been very lucky. And I think when sometimes people ask me how I've managed to get wherever it is that I've managed to get, I realize that it's been through a series of fortunate events in a system that really wasn't designed for my success. And what I remind them of is that there are at least 10 people behind me who didn't have those lucky breaks and remain where they are, but have just as much ability. And on the issue of liberty, I think the United States, as I'm a constitutional lawyer, and I know that we have what we call a libertarian presumption in our Constitution. We focus on the individual and individuals' rights and individuals' freedoms. And I would say that equity is a necessary precondition to liberty. The two things don't exist in opposition to each other. If we want people to have liberty, then they must start from a place where they have an opportunity. And equity is the extension of that opportunity. And I think it enlivens liberty. So for my business friends who have that libertarian strain, I often get them to think a little bit differently about what equity means in a business context. Equity is opening up your opportunities. It's not constraining.
Kendra, any thoughts on that question?
Phil?
I would share this with you. My colleague, Letitia Vaughn, wrote a blog, I think last month. And what she said is this. She said, what we do for other people's children will never be enough unless it is good enough for our own children. And I'm not sure I can say much more about that as we're talking and thinking about education. And of course, now I'm going to say something else, right? So there's a tremendous resource in this community, the Racial Equity Institute. It is provided by the YWCA. It's an incredible, and I will say up front, 2-day opportunity to expand one's understanding of both history and context, and I would say what puts everybody who attends on a new journey, on a new path, and it's an incredible resource. I would almost argue it's a must, particularly in this moment in time. And the Cradle to Career team has participated in part 1. There's a part 2, but that's an incredible asset for this community and for this region.
So sort of speaking, symbolically, it seems that right now it takes tragedy for some of these symbols to come down, statues to come down with a tragic killing or a church shooting with 9 people murdered here prompted the Confederate flag to come down from the State House. And, just how culturally, how do we get past that where we're in a different place? I mean, we're sort of at this intersection. There's a lot of things going on. How can we use this time to kind of get past all of that, where we're sort of accelerating our future in terms of that? Any thoughts there, John? You want to grab that?
Sure. One thing that I'll point out is that when the flag came down from the State House, one of the critical moments was when the business community came out and said, this is enough. And we can't continue to operate like this. The state can't continue to go on like this. The legislature listens to the business community, and it is a powerful voice. And so when we think of leadership, I don't just think of leadership as leading a team or leading a group. I think of it as acting with conviction. And the business community now and going forward has an opportunity to be a greater leader and helping us to think differently about what it means to engage in a capitalist endeavor. Capitalism itself isn't bad. It is simply being aware of what Arthur Oken once said: the big winners feed their pets better than the losers can feed their children. What do we do with those who are left out? We want competition. We want people to be able to pursue their entrepreneurial dreams. But what do we do with those people who are left behind, and what responsibility do we have for them? And that's a conversation that the business community can lead, which would be useful, and it would allow us to come to a consensus around our political differences. The political differences can always be there. We can argue about the value of big government versus small government, but effective solutions for effective government could be where we're focused, and that, I think, is a place to start.
Any further thoughts on that before I jump?
So well said.
I agree.
So I'll just segue from that and ask you guys to talk a little bit about educational attainment and specifically graduation rates. We still have a lot of students that are not graduating from high school, and 35% for black students, 17% for white students in the region. I mean, there's a ton of room for improvement there. Let's talk a little bit about graduation rates and what can we do to improve that. You want to start there, Kendra?
Sure. And I think that has been one of the great challenges, but that our community has faced right now. And one of the things we have seen when communities do move the needle on this, areas like Cincinnati or other communities that have struggled with this as well, is that a really strong coalition gathering around shared goals and putting all of their resources targeting these shared goals. And so I do believe in our area, we have a lot of people working on various aspects of this problem, but we have yet, and I think this has really started through Tri-County Cradle for Career and their efforts to all start to come together to say, we're gonna be on the same page, we're gonna be focused, and we're gonna really get to the root of what some of these challenges are. And I really don't think it's until these recent events that we've been able to have some real honest and authentic conversations about systemic racism or some of the other barriers that exist. So, I think in order for us to really do this, we've got to come together as a community and all agree that we're going to target our resources to some outcomes and determine what those are and how we're going to get there.
Phyllis?
Just backing into what Kendra was saying, returning to education the way our system operated pre-COVID really isn't the goal here. We have to return better, and arguably, but we are at a moment in time where I think the window is open to really take the hard step of examining the systems and policies and practices that were built intentionally so that Black children and brown children were not educated in the same way as white children. We have to ask ourselves, who was the education system built for? And how is that working? And what are the changes that we need to make? We have to ask ourselves how we can ensure that all children, especially those most impacted by systemic racism, have access to the resources and supports that they need to thrive. We have to change our mental model, whether conscious or subconscious, that Black and brown children can't learn or aren't as bright. We have to learn to talk about this work and data from an asset perspective, not a deficit-based perspective, which would then shift the conversation from children to systems or policies or practices. And I think we're just at a critical juncture where we have to ask ourselves those questions. How we ensure that teachers are best equipped to have conversations with students, courageous conversations with students and families, how we're working with the healthcare community to ensure what would seemingly be simple things, but particularly in time of COVID, where we are in terms of children just receiving their vaccination. So it ranges the gamut, but from our perspective, it really is doing the hard work of looking at systems, policies, and practices, and then working to make impact in those areas where we need to. And that could be amplifying what is working as well as changing what is not.
John, any thoughts on improving graduation rates?
Just to say that right now we're in the midst of a moment of wild experimentation because of the various changes that schools have been forced into. And my hope is that we can capture some learning here and really understand that there are multiple ways of delivering instruction, creating educational environments that can be responsive to the needs of students if we focus on those three things, developing them as people, as citizens, and as workers, and focusing more on how to learn as opposed to what to learn. What we want to do is to enable people to be self-directed learners ultimately, and to be critical consumers of content. And that will shift outcomes. I think what we're seeing in terms of low graduation rates is also and effect of a system that really isn't designed to achieve the outcomes that I mentioned, what I think those three roles of education should be.
So that's a little bit of a segue into the question we got from the audience, which is e-learning, and will that help or hurt graduation rates this year? And I think in the context of what you guys were talking about earlier, where so many students don't have access to the internet, does that suddenly create a bigger gap, even though we're trying to help people learn remotely? Want to tackle that one, anyone?
Sure. I mean, from what research has suggested so far, unless there is a way to ensure equitable access so that everyone has the technology necessary to be able to participate in e-learning, it is going to harm the people who are already at the highest risk and most vulnerable to not graduating to begin with. So, if we make some progress with some of the things that have been discussed earlier, there's potential that it could help in the long run, but right now it appears to have detrimental impacts on the people who need the most support.
Any other thoughts on that?
No, I think as John, I'm not sure this is exactly what you said, but we are in somewhat of experimentation mode. I would like for us to think about that question maybe a little bit differently, and this is the year 2020, and we are asking ourselves, how will e-learning or can e-learning be effective? And I think those are the kinds of questions that in the year 2020 we really need to ask ourselves. Why are we just asking that question, right? And that is not meant as a criticism. It is meant as a genuine, how can we ask, what other questions should we be asking? And also, how is it possible that we have, Kendra, I think you said roughly 40,000 households without access to broadband in this year.
So we're gonna, in all of this, are we gonna have a sort of a lost, I won't say generation, but a lost couple of years here for students? I mean, and how will that affect college enrollment and some of those things? And I'm got somebody from the College of Charleston sitting here, and so I know you guys are having to talk about this because we're talking about impacts on our business from all kinds of stuff. So how, Well,
I think one of the things we've seen at the higher education level is this is also requiring colleges to think differently and to become more flexible or to determine different ways to evaluate young people, and then how we can also help support the K through 12 system so that students are still able to come to college adequately prepared. And the other thing I would say is that in the K through 12 systems here, we have amazing teachers and amazing folks in our schools who are thinking about this and who are preparing for this. But there's so much, as we've already discussed, that is in the unknown. But I think I have a lot of confidence in our teachers and understanding the needs of their students, but also a lot of respect for the heavy lift they're going to have to do this year, because for some kids, summer vacation started in March, while other kids continued to have opportunities to learn. So this gap is just going to be the largest we've ever seen. And I think that's a conversation that is going on right now very often at the schools, is how are they going to deal with that when they get back? And, I think I have confidence we're going to rise to the occasion, and we're just going to have to do some things differently than we've done in the past, and the way we are able to re-educate students and evaluate them. And for those of us in higher ed, it is, again, forcing us to think differently about what we'll have to do on our end that we traditionally haven't, and how we can determine if students are college ready and what we can do to support them in becoming that way.
John, any thoughts on that sort of gap that's being created?
Yeah, it further highlights disparities that we see within society. If my son, who's 15, decided when he finished high school that he needed to take a year or 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 off and find himself or learn something new, he'd have the ability to do that.
You're
And
such a nice dad. My parents would never have let me take off.
yeah, well, he's a good kid, so I give him a lot of latitude. But what we see with the disparity is that for some populations there are no second chances. It's a real tightrope. So if you have that semester, that year of lost learning, it can have detrimental lifetime consequences. So drawing a circle around that and thinking, how can we intervene? And by we, I mean all of those pieces: tech, government, business, education, social sector. How can we intervene to essentially give students in that population a second chance or a third chance, so that they have some of the luxuries that we might be able to afford for our own children, and typically aren't extended to them? And it's not a luxury in this case. This is about equipping them to really participate in the workforce, and that may mean additional resources. It may mean additional time in a formal educational environment, but also pathways to apprenticeships, pathways to engaging in employment opportunities that might not otherwise be available. So here again, businesses can be creative with how they bring people into their organizations and what kind of training they can provide, maybe in conjunction with the university or technical college, so that we can make up for these gaps in learning and lost learning time.
So this has been a fascinating conversation. We could go on for the rest of the day, I'm certain, because this is so important. But we do have to end here, and I just want to thank John and Kendra and Phyllis for coming in and doing this with us. And just want to remind everybody out there that in October we'll be doing this again, and we'll be looking at the effects of the pandemic on our needs for cybersecurity and how that's affecting the region locally, and what are some of the solutions that are out there that we can put in place for that. So thank everybody once again for coming, and we will see you next time.